Welcome to today's lecture on the science of learning. This slideshow will provide a brief introduction to foundations for our class on cognitive learning theory. As you watch this video lecture, take your own notes, trying to highlight important ideas as you go and questions as you go. First, let's begin by discussing evidence and its relationship to educational practice. Unfortunately, there is a long-standing failure to have evidence actually inform our practice. This has been noted as far back as the 1970s when Fred Kurlinger delivered a presidential address at AERA on this topic. And unfortunately, little has changed. In 2013, Henry Roediger III offered pretty much the same conclusions as Kurlinger did back 3 decades prior. And in 2018, so did I. However, cognitive science has made some significant strides in recent decades and provides us with real potential to break this trend and provide the way to a more purposeful, evidence-informed educational practice in the future. So what are some of the major reasons why evidence has not impacted our practice as we might hope that it would have? Here, I'm going to outline just a few reasons, but we'll explore plenty more, including many widespread myths that educators and people broadly widely believe throughout this class. The first reason that why this can happen is that when research results are displayed in ways that misrepresent the findings and lead others to make unwarranted conclusions. For example, take a look at the 2 displays of this exact same data. The one on the left seems to indicate a steady but significant growth in average SAT scores over time. The other, however, contextualizes the numbers appropriately so that we see that this slight increase is real. But when you put it at the scale it's actually done, it's not even close to the represented by what you see in the first one. The first one is skewed in such a way that it looks like a big change. The other one does a better job of contextualizing this. So as scholars, in training, it's crucial that you make it a top priority to representing things as accurately as you can, and that means paying attention to context. A second reason why evidence is often lost in translation is that research results are often published in peer-reviewed outlets, but then picked up by media and other groups who often sensationalize the findings because they misunderstand them, or deliberately misrepresent them, or spin them in such a way that it just goes the way they want. Here's an example from a news story about a study published by Harvard researchers. Surely that must mean it's a good study, right? Nope. Actually, the fact that someone is from Harvard does not bestow upon them any magical powers to get things right. And the actual study about which the news article is writing has serious methodological flaws. We may dive into those later, but for now, the point is that things are often lost in translation because even if data are reported accurately, we still have to understand how the study was conducted and what the evidence for their claims are, and that is often something that people skip over. Everyone seems to be in a rush to get to application or why it matters, but as scholar practitioners committed to letting evidence inform our practice, our research, and our leadership, we have to slow down and train ourselves to critically examine findings so that we can better apply them. Furthermore, we also have problems with trusting our own intuition, on which almost everyone makes our own decisions. Again, let's just look at a few of these. First, our feelings are often wrong. It may be true that you prefer a certain type of instructional style, for instance, but feeling is not likely to predict how much you learn from it. For example, students that think they learn best when they review their notes and reread material, etc. It's not to say these are bad practices, but they are not as effective as testing or employing retrieval practice through flashcards. But those things feel harder, and so students tend to like them less. So feelings are often wrong. The point is, first issue is that our feelings are fickle, and they can easily mislead us. Second, cognitive psychology has empirically established the fact that our minds, while amazing, are prone to a great number of biases. Just take a look at this chart. You can pause my video and glance through it if you want. But in particular, I'm going to zero in on one, confirmation bias, in which we hold much lower standards for assessing the truth of claims that fit with things we already believe, but much higher standards for assessing the truth of claims that we do not fit with what we already believe. Simply put, we are biased to confirm what we already believed. And that is not all. There are many cognitive biases that negatively impact our intuition. Again, just glancing through this table, these things are at work in each of us. So as we move together in learning about learning, let us commit to letting evidence and not lore or just mere intuition inform our understanding of practice. So let's take a quick detour before we wrap up this introductory lecture. There are a variety of different perspectives that we can take when we look at learning. For the most part in this class, we're going to give our top priority to the cognitive perspective. This approach really wants to get at what people whom we're studying understand and believe, and what that means is that we rely on testing them using various assessments to measure their understanding. But there's also a behavioral perspective. This approach dominated psychology for much of the 20th century and is a foundation for a lot of the research that we currently work on. This follows a similar approach, but rather than trying to get at thinking of individuals, the emphasis here is on the behavior, the outward actions, and more recently, inner physical actions such as the firing of synapses. And so neuroscience, while not pure behaviorism, certainly fits in that category. So these are the last broad perspective that I'm going to introduce is a social perspective. These approaches are significantly different in that they tend to be less interested in attempting to understand generalized truths about people and are more focused on unique aspects of individuals. The perspective has been a prominent one in education. However, it's not going to be as deep of a focus in this class, and you will no doubt be exposed to a great deal of this perspective throughout the program, but its emphasis is on description and uniqueness and is less relevant for the purposes of this class, which is looking at these broadly applicable principles of learning. So, as we're about to close out this introductory lecture on the science of learning, let me close with my own 5 steps. These are 5 steps I would encourage all of you to adopt in becoming evidence-informed scholar practitioners. Step 1 is to identify principles and axioms. That's going to be a central part of this class, and that's why we want to begin with these broad general truths. By starting with these broad general truths, we can keep them in our minds and help from there inform what we do. Step number 2 is to study your specific context. Understanding the basic truths about learning from these axioms, such as the fact that memory is the residue of thought, does not necessarily tell us how to apply that principle. So it is worth our time to study the specific context into which we're going to apply these principles. Step 3 is then to actually put the principles into practice, taking them as a non-negotiable and yet applying them in a manner that seems appropriate for that context. So the principles or axioms inform your application in the context. And that moves us into our 4th step. Step 4 will require that we systematically examine the effectiveness of our attempted application. We don't settle for merely trying it out and saying, well, it fits with my theory, therefore it's good. No, we want to know what works, to what extent it works, and whether or not it's worth the effort. That means we have to constantly measure our own effectiveness. And that leads us to our step 5. So finally, step 5 is to reflect on what the evidence tells us. Did this work as we anticipated? Could it have been better? Were there unanticipated factors that affected our efforts, and so forth? Through this iterative cycle of reflection on evidence that is derived from our systematic application of principles to practice, we will become evidence-informed scholar practitioners. Here are the references for this lecture. Wrap up by writing a short summary of today's lecture and posting any questions that you've got in the forum. Thank you for watching.